Hi, welcome to another episode of the Innovating Together podcast. I'm your host, Bridget Burns with the University Innovation Alliance. And today I'm delighted to bring you a show where we're going to have a fantastic guest and a rich conversation that I think is exactly perfectly timed for where higher education needs to be focusing its efforts today. But first, I want to talk about how this podcast and this show is sponsored by Mainstay and the Carnegie Corporation of New York. Mainstay used to be known as AdmitHub way, long time ago, not anymore. They are the student engagement and retention platform that has proven it works through peer-reviewed research and independent validation in a way that we hope other ed tech companies engage in that kind of research. They've already shown that they can reduce summer melt. They did it at Georgia State by reducing theirs by 21% and helping them retain 1,200 students that they wouldn't otherwise would have lost. So especially as people are feeling those significant enrollment pressures, you might take a look at mainstay.com. And the Carnegie Corporation of New York is a longtime benefactor and sponsor and support of the UIA. We are very grateful for their assistance. And now I get to bring my new guest on. Dan, thank you so much for being here. For those at home, Dan Greenstein, who when we first met, you were the head of post-secondary success at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, but you had already had a long career working for the UCs. You were a librarian. You've done all kinds of stuff in a variety of places. And now for the past 5 years, you really took a wild turn and you became the chancellor of the Pennsylvania system of higher education. And I noticed online, and perhaps folks at home might have noticed that you started a blog and you've been writing some really interesting stuff. So I wanted to bring you on. So thanks for being our guest today.
Oh, well, thanks for having me. Really appreciate being here. Nice to see you.
So it's very unusual for someone who's actively in kind of the trenches of transformation to force themselves to stop and actually observe what they're learning, synthesize it, and think about sharing it. I think we see a lot of books from people who are retired, and that often can feel not as helpful because it's not in real time. And, it's sometimes it's storytelling about the actor rather than wisdom to help arm the field. And I feel like what you're doing is the opposite. You're publishing blog posts. We tell folks about kind of what prompted you to do this.
Yeah, it's so interesting. It goes back to, my days at Gates and the work at Gates was really, and still is, not just in the post-secondary strategy, but in many of the areas that they're working. The idea is to find things that work in solving a particular problem and then helping to support their widespread adoption. So within the post-secondary success area, it was to, find ways of improving outcomes for, marginalized students, for low-income students, students of color. And it's not good enough to know, right? Oh, here's some things that work. It's really important to get a lot of people to kind of, to adopt those strategies because they're good for students, and frankly, they're good for the universities that are helping their students succeed. And so we had long and rich conversations about, well, how do you encourage adoption of things, of learning that may be helpful. And I'm not sure, and so just steeped in that tradition. And so, here at the Pennsylvania state system, recognizing on the way in, the state system, as you know, when I got here 2018, 14 universities, really regional publics, teaching mostly to the master's level, serving predominantly low and middle income students. They are the sort of the gritty part. They're part of that sort of the gritty part, the larger part of the higher education ecosystem in the country. That serves most of our students, quite frankly, in the 4-year space and the 2-year space. They were in trouble, facing the kind of demographic pressures, the financial pressures, the underfunding from the state, the enrollment decline, the demographic cliff. All that stuff was like, all that stuff that everybody talks about, it was just super acute here. And so, okay, well, what do you do? And literally the reason to come here was to sort of, are there ways to work with these really important, vitally important institutions, or engines of social mobility and economic development, and carve out a future for them that's viable and sustainable into the future. And that was the goal. And of course, well, if you're going to try it, you might as well sort of give lessons back to the field, good and bad, things that work, things that don't. And so, the blog really derives from that, from that real passion about paying it forward, giving back to the field lessons learned, in the hope that, others can build on, or, at least short circuit, not make quite as many mistakes, or, short circuit their path to success based on mistakes and learning that we have made. And so the form I took, it was originally a book. And then I gave a conference presentation about 6 months ago. And I realized in the course of the back and forth, people don't want your stupid words in a book. They want the lessons and, shut up with your words. And so, okay, it's a blog, right? So, and it's kind of one lesson per blog. And then I try to attach what I call assets to them. These are like tools and templates and policies and approaches so that people can just have at it, right? So here's some things that we use, the tangible assets that then people can, download, adapt, adopt, whatever. So that's really the purpose. It's lessons learned, trying to sort of recognizing the problems that we're facing are not anything like unique, and trying to synthesize what are the generalizable lessons, return them to the field with maybe some tools that could help others, along the way.
So that gives me a couple of things I want to ask about, because I think that a lot of folks might hold back and only share their insights, do a postmortem years later, because they get us at the record and nobody gets to dispute it, right? But you put yourself in a vulnerable position that's in a positive way, that people could say, no, that's not the lesson. In fact, in real time, these people are still here right now and you're actively doing it, and they could possibly push back. I want to know what the response has been, but I also want to dig into this idea of there's something really magical about the architecture or the structure of the way you share. Because if you share in a way that is, here's what glamorizing and just telling the story, that's not useful for the reader. What's useful is what you're doing, which is like, here's what I wish I'd known before I started. Boy, you want to know what I regret? Hang on for a sec. That's the kind of stuff that actually gets people and feels like you're being generous, as opposed to just trying to document your success.
Yeah. And it's actually, I have some great mentors and also some shout outs to people, I mean, Jeff Salingo out there, he does this as a routine matter and so effortlessly well. Michael Horn, you're very active in podcasting and other ways. Goldie Blumenstake at the Chronicle, and I've spoken to all these people to get information from them about their craft, and I'm not anywhere at their level, but the tips and tricks that I've collected along the way have been super helpful. But some of the and including some of the publishers I talked to when originally it was a book, some other folks whose input I really honor. One of the things though that people say is think about the lessons that are generalizable. Think about how you make them generalizable. And then, don't just talk about, to your point, don't just talk about the successes. And I really try at the end of every blog to say, well, how well does whatever it is really work, right? And that's for me, in some ways, it's the most intellectually challenging part of the exercise, telling the story. And here's the stuff that we did. That's, it's good, and you have to be brief, and you try to be a little compelling. But it's that critical moment at the end, which I find to be that it takes the longest. It's the thing I ended up editing most, because I rewrite and I rewrite. But it's also, I think that's the part that I enjoy, and that really is, it's an insight that I was provided in conversations with these folks who do this stuff really well.
I mean, I think that's good advice, but there's a fundamental difference between you, Goldie, Jeff, and Michael. Like, I am friends with them, and they are not actively leading the work in the field. Michael might be, because he does consulting, but Jeff is he still is kind of an author. He's a commentator. He's an observer. He does some work with the Georgetown Center, with the A's to Georgetown Academy, but part of, I think what's been a really helpful for him and for Goldie is as a journalist, you kind of you stay apart as an observer, but you don't have that. You are actually out, you're in the trenches with people, you're getting dirt on your face. And so I think it's smart that you gathered their insight. I think it's also, again, it's really refreshing to see someone actively putting themselves out there, doing and leading the change, and while also not waiting to share the lessons someday later when when they have the luxury of kind of rewriting history, because I feel like it's a very collaborative diffusion strategy. You're opening yourself up in a way that other people can probably add on to the lesson and say, you think that was interesting, but also I got this from this, and I was a faculty member or whatever.
Yeah, and that's actually the purpose, and it's interesting too, because, coming into it, you think, what's going to be interesting, and then going through the process, the things you thought were going to be important aren't always, and the things you never even thought about, all of a sudden, the significance of them sort of grows in front of your eyes. And so, and the journey, although I'm sure every journey will be very specific and contextual, local to a particular place, set of institutions, political context, culture, et cetera. I do think that there is a playbook that's there are playbooks, I should say, that are beginning to emerge. And, we're in trouble in higher ed. I don't know if you noticed. And,
what?
And in a lot of different ways at a lot of different levels.
Yeah.
And so this kind of radical collaboration, a phrase I just got the other day and visiting a university nearby. And this kind of radical collaboration across the industry, the kind of stuff that you do at the University Innovation Alliance, the kind of stuff that Tony Bright talked about, at Carnegie, building network improvement communities to accelerate the pace of change. That information sharing, the critical kind of back and forth of ideas and tools, I think it gets more, not less important, as the problems that we face become more challenging, more urgent, and frankly, more vital that we solve them for the benefit of the country.
That's great. So I want to talk about the transformation itself, and I want to understand for you. So you've been sharing about building a culture. Like, how did you actually shift Pennsylvania folks, or the system? How did you support the shift? I would say, because you definitely have not made it feel like you've been the hand of God forcing change, but rather you have invited people a part of a very long multi-year process to reimagine who you are, how you govern yourselves, how you hold yourselves accountable. And one of that is like data. So you talked about the becoming more really focused on data. I'm just wondering, of all these changes and all these shifts that you've shared about, what caught you off guard the most, or what was the most surprising for you as you came in with your very curious, informed perspective from Gates?
Yeah.
But really, I'm sure it was wildly different.
Yeah, I'll tell you that, and I've talked about this with my, members of my team, and all, folks at the office of the Chancellor, but also our presidents who are very closely involved in the work, and fantastic group of people. I have this group of blogs about building drains and toilets, right? And it goes back to my library days. And the idea is that, you can't launch off on doing really interesting, innovative work until you've got some of the foundational tools in place. And you can't necessarily, when you're kind of trying to, reimagine your business models and your educational models to sort of sustain an institution and to improve its productivity in terms of the number of credentials it's able to produce. You need some fundamental, some foundational stuff. You need good governance. You need accountability. You need to begin to build the data-driven culture. You need great data resources and people who know how to use them and routinely use them in decision making, right? And you just can't assume that your organization is up to all that. And so, you go in, you create this great strategy. It's going to be cool. There's all these bells and whistles, change agency, and then you realize, oh crap, the organization is actually not equipped to do any of this stuff. And the time it took, and so I talk about it in terms of investing in mending drains and toilets, and investing in them. The time it took to put that stuff in place, that was a big surprise to me. It's just like, the fact that you needed to do it to improve organizational capability didn't surprise me. The fact that work in itself was so consuming and required so much discipline, consistency, staff time, investment, et cetera. I think that was a surprise. A good lesson. It's one of the lessons in one of the blogs, I think.
I definitely, I think my team probably could attest to this, that I often think things will take less time than they do. I often think, I could just, what I could do? I can just pull an all-nighter. Turn that around, get that proposal out the door. We could just do that in a couple of months. And it's like, oh man, people vastly underestimate how difficult and how slow change is. And what I find interesting is that people often dismiss any of the actors who don't, immediately jump and run to be part of it as uninnovative or as resistant. And they just lack the common decency of the empathy needed to be able to truly lead people, which is recognizing what change really is. It is, you're going to impact my life. I might not have a job. You might eliminate the chance that I can feed my family, or I get to live in this community that I've spent my life. Like, we just don't think about the emotional aspect of it, and then create space for people to slowly turn their temperature, their resting heart rate up a bit to the new idea. We just are like, you're either in or you're out. I guess you're not innovative, and it's very dismissive.
Yeah, there's a couple of great books. One by Chip and Fred Heath, the Heath brothers, called Switch, which really addresses the emotional aspects of change leadership. And then there's another one called The Change Monster. I can't remember the name of the authors. They're two ex-Boston Consulting Group folks. It's a little dated, but they're fantastic. And they talk about, you have to be available. You have to connect with your people at an empathic level because, especially the more transformative the change, people are going to be, they're going to be afraid, they're going to be exhilarated, they're going to be angry, they're going to be frustrated, and sometimes all at the same time, right? And so you just have to let that happen, and you have to, understand it's real and sort of design around it, to be perfectly honest. It's a very human enterprise.
So that's a helpful insight. Let's move to my next question, which is, if you could wave a magic wand and change a decision that you made leading this transformation or supporting this transformation, if you were coaching Dan from 5 years ago, what tips would you give him running into this? What is there a change that you think would make things a little easier?
Yeah, I'll give you three. One real quick. The first one is go slow to go fast. The mending your drains and toilets. Just accommodate. It's going to take time. Just get on it. The other one is, so it goes back to this governance. One of the challenges that we faced was, how do you, we're a system of originally 14 universities. They're pretty independent. They're managed by, presidents. They're presidents or CEOs of their universities. And you want to engage them in this enterprise-wide effort, which is this fundamental redesign of the system's educational business models to produce different outcomes. Initially to stop the financial decline, which was pretty serious. And so, the approach was to engage them in the work. They became, I think of them as co-investors, thought partners. They're strategy partners. They're partners in strategy and execution, and co-investors in it, because we're a single system. It's a single bank account. If one university has trouble paying its bills, all the others have to basically use their money to pay, bail the other ones out. So they have a vested interest in collaborating in that way. So creating the space for that collaboration is important. Of course, we started on the budgetary stuff, and we, created budget processes, which we held each other accountable for using. That horizontal accountability was really important in getting people to manage their budgets differently in a very financially sustainable way. But the other thing we learned was that as they began to do that, we began to realize what were the key drivers of financial decline, because we could look across the entire system of 14 universities, who's successful, who's struggling. And through that kind of analytical process, that process of working together on figuring out how to do sustainable budgeting, we began to identify practices that seemed to work. And then we began to document those practices. And then we began to turn those practices into playbooks. One of the reasons I want to prepare this blog and get these playbooks out there. And then we began to hold each other accountable for implementing these playbooks. So it builds that kind of network improvement community. And we sort of learned that together over 5 years. And I'm thinking, wow, if we had known that on day one, we would have had like a bunch of, so now we have playbooks in financially sustainable budgeting, financially sustainable academic program array management and course scheduling, financial aid optimization, enrollment management. And we just keep moving on as we discover more of these key drivers, and I'm thinking, man, if we had known this on day one, we'd be up to like 9 or 10, and the performance improvement would just have been accelerated. And so it's just one of those things like, oh, wow, I wish we'd had that. And anyway, so that's two, and I'll spare you the third. But you kind of wake up and you think, oh, there's things I wish I had. I'll give you one other. When we ended up, as a long-winded story, which I won't bore you with, but we ended up integrating 6 universities into 2, and went through a very detailed planning process. It was inclusive. It was contentious. I don't recommend anyone doing this for fun. It was essential to ensure students, particularly at our smaller rural institutions, had access to full breadth of academic programming. And I really, hats off to the people who did the work and are continuing to do the work as these enterprises, continue to integrate. It's a long journey. But when you're building something new, like a fundamentally different construct for a university, one that operates over a wide area, and you have 3 universities blended into one, you're building a new culture, you're blending all sorts of organizational, educational, and business processes. It's not clear that the capabilities that you have, which are really good at running universities, are the capabilities you need to do that kind of merger, that integration type work. And I'm not sure what we would have done differently, having recognized that. Probably spend more time thinking about, okay, what are the organizational capabilities? Where do they need to be strengthened in order to accommodate this new kind of work? And maybe strengthen them up front, as opposed to afterwards when you realize, oh my God, there's a problem. How do we fix it? We got to throw support at this. So maybe that was the third one.
Well, I mean, I'm sure that it made you wildly popular to do that. I'm sure that it was
not super.
You were beloved by everyone. The idea of a merger, I can't think of an example where someone's been like, yeah, that was really like people love me for that. No, that's a very difficult change. And so one of the things I've observed is, and I picked this up from my first few years in the Alliance, is that the motivation for change and that there's, people do it for lots of reasons, but the fanfare for driving and for doing something hard is kind of the same as doing something small. Like the confetti size for low-hanging fruit at a university driving change is honestly like the exact same amount of confetti you're going to get for doing PASSHE change. And that is what's messed up, is that it creates a bias where I find that university leaders are easily drawn to doing little tiny stuff that's kind of around the edges, because it's not really worth it enough to do this really hard stuff. Like, they're here for a limited amount of time. You and I are talking about the rapid turnover and transition, but I feel like there is, an unfair or unequal incentive and reward for what you're doing, because I know of institutions that have done very small things and they get a couple articles, they get, maybe they get to tell their story, maybe it gets in the news and otherwise. And I don't know that there is going to be a big enough, like, I know that you're driving for actually outcomes change for your students and for sustainability of your system that was otherwise probably going to die, or would have limped along because we avoid change. But I'm just curious about that piece. If you've observed that, like, at times, maybe, wow, I get why people don't change. I get why they don't do this. It's just so obvious why you're a little, it's wild that you're doing this and you're sticking around.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard. Look, I mean, it's interesting. Our universities, most, I would say, of our universities and colleges are legacy centric. Right. And actually there's good reason for that. I think their legacy centrism is almost a kind of a built-in mode of quality assurance, right? They're slow to chase fads. That's a good thing, in my view. So but at the same time, they are not built to undertake this kind of massive transformation, and you can't do it as one person. So in order to undertake something like this, you've got to enlist a lot of folks. You got to build. It takes a village, right? And everybody in that village is doing really hard work, and it's really important to sort of support each other. And I mean, those playbooks are one way that we support each other. There are all sorts of others, but they're going to get, they're going to take a bunch of arrows, and so it's really important to align around the mission. To provide, there's a blog, I think it is this week or last, about the accountability regime, holding people accountable for good outcomes, but sort of up front saying, look, this is a people-centered accountability. You've got to provide, this is hard work. You have to provide your leaders with support. And when I talk about leaders, I'm not like presidents and provosts, and yes, those people too. But in this kind of change work, everybody's a leader. We have in the integration, in the integrated schools, it was the faculty. We're talking, frontline faculty, not necessarily chairs and people with seniority or positions, who are basically doing the work of rewriting and integrating the curriculum, and staff who are figuring out how to blend practice in IR shops and financial aid packaging kind of units. How do we become one? So everybody, you're asking a lot of people to step up into leadership roles, and you're asking them not only to step up into leadership roles, but to change their behaviors and practices and those of their colleagues around them. And so, you're really asking a lot of folks to do hard work. And I think recognizing that, and it does build in resistance. It's not like if I don't need to do that, maybe I don't. But we had a sense of urgency. There was, it was existential. A, and B, we were like so many in public higher education, we're mission driven. Right. Our historic mission is to be engines of social mobility and economic development, to provide that, bridged opportunity for people who otherwise would not have one, whether they're in rural Pennsylvania or sort of downtown Philadelphia or Pittsburgh. Right. And so, and people who work in these places, they're not here to, make tons of money or drive fancy cars or to sort of go into their golfing, to sort of feed their golfing habit or whatever. They're here because they are driven by that mission. And so, when you begin to recognize that the only way that we can continue to be as we always have been, it's a profound conservatism, this kind of radical change, is like we're changing everything so basically we can stay the same, so that we can continue to drive our historic mission. And that kind of thing, you can begin to sort of appeal to ideas and values that people have and inspire them to do the hard work, because in doing the hard work, they're doing what they signed up to do and what they chose to do for their careers, sort of on steroids.
It's great that, I mean, again, I feel like we were talking about this, that there's massive turnover in the sector right now, that the stakes are higher, these positions are more fraught, and it feels like it's a harder job. And then you are an outlier in terms of doing long-term systemic change work in one of those harder jobs. Whereas I think that the more difficult and tenuous these positions become, leading universities, leading systems, the more you're seeing people losing their jobs on a regular basis and turnover, the less likely I think people will be brave and bold and willing to take on systemic change, because systemic change it's just so much harder and murkier than doing a quick win, grabbing the low-hanging fruit and let's see if we can celebrate the W for this. So I love that you're doing it. I do think that we have to think about as a sector about the incentives and rewards for doing hard work, because we can hope that people have altruistic intentions and that they're going to show up with the kind of curiosity that you brought into this program, this system. I think that was one of the things, is that you came from a lens of deep curiosity. That was probably the most defining characteristic about you at Gates, is like you were really interested in this stuff. It was fascinating to you. And then you came in, and I think that curiosity coupled with it was connected to humility, but I think it also helped convey humility, your questions. And so people didn't feel like you came in with like, here's Dan's plan. Like, we're going to do what I said. And because I thought it. So you've been successful, but I feel like I worry about others. I worry about about the sector making the other hard choices that others need to make.
Well, it's such a good point. And we were blessed. I mean, I have a fantastic board chair, Cindy Shapiro. I mean, she's been a board chair, I think now for 8 years. She's fantastic. And she has created a culture on the board. Obviously there's turnover on the board, as you'd expect, but it continues to have a culture of, it's data driven. It's super focused on mission. It's outcomes, bias for action, outcomes oriented. And this is going to sound weird, Bridget, but we have, I feel blessed by the quality of the elected leaders in the elected representatives, Senate, House, governor's administration. This is the second one. They care about public higher education. They care in different ways. They have different kind of views of how it should evolve. But the people in the relevant committees and leadership roles, who are attached in some way to education, workforce development, they are some of the richest and most creative and frankly informed conversations that I am able to have are with folks who have that deep, caring. It's not always fun, and we don't always agree on stuff, but you feel this tremendous support from, in effect, the board, which is the sort of obviously the governing body, and the legislature, which really holds the purse strings and frankly owns the universities by statute. So I think that's been, I haven't written about that yet, and maybe that's a new blog I'll have to add. But I think one of the success drivers is those stars have aligned here in ways that I'm not sure is entirely common. And it's important, I think, at the policy level in particular, to recognize that legislators and boards of governors and the public institutions, they really have a role to play. Mm-hmm. And they don't have to, agreeing on stuff is a high bar, but, locking arms and trying to get something fixed or something improved is really important. And we've benefited from that. And, I think that it shows up in our funding. It shows up in some of the successes we've had. And it's work, because you got to bring a whole lot of people along, and you have to be brought along by them. But it's definitely a success driver.
I love that, and it makes me think about because I think about other states. I think about how Pennsylvania is a great case study of a state that really needed change. Like, it was obvious from the outside, from the data, that the system that was originally developed is no longer really in alignment with what the future was going to need. Major, like demographics and industry change. I hope other states will go through the same this reflective process to make sure that what they are working with in higher education that was built in the past, is it really what's going to position them for the future, and are willing to do the hard stuff. Because I remember in the Oregon system, I was responsible for shepherding the legislation that initially creates the Higher Education Coordinating Commission. And then when I was gone on my ACE fellowship, they passed the legislation to disband the university system, right? So, probably could have seen that coming since I was the chief of staff for the university system, but I was gone. But I think that I remember how many times in the prior decade when I was on the State Board of Higher Ed, the talk about closing and consolidating campuses had come up, and we never did anything because of fear of upsetting legislators, of fear of how hard it was going to be. And I think what you're putting forward is, if you can really get clear about what a state is going to need to connect talent and opportunity in the future of work, and put forward a compelling vision,
right,
you can unite stakeholders and constituents that
right.
you might think would be difficult
Yeah.
and opposed to it.
Yeah, I mean, what's really interesting, and Pennsylvania, is a swing state. It's a very closely divided state, divided government from party perspective. The thing that has really, so in order to do anything, you've got to build a coalition at the middle, which you could argue is the hardest thing to do in American politics today. But the thing that has enabled us to do that is workforce, is economic development, is our role in that arena. And it is, you just keep making that case and plugging. It's an obvious case to make. And you just keep plugging away, and people really get it. Where we're going to get our nurses from is a big deal. Our teachers, our IT professionals, our manufacturing,
home health aides.
Yep. And look, Kim Hunter-Reid down in Louisiana, she's doing similar work. She's able to work to build coalition. Harrison Keller at Texas, probably a front runner in all this. He's just.
I know, but now he's going to a campus. It's going to be wild without him.
It's going to be interesting to see. Well, I mean, it'll be interesting to see how sticky it is, right? I mean, and you hope that there's so much energy that it gets institutionalized. So there are these points of light, and that's, it's relevant here. We didn't make any of this. Like, when we did integration, I reached out to Shelley Nickel, who was the vice chancellor for strategy at the Georgia system, who really was, at point in driving the Georgia integrations. And she, came in an advisory role to the chancellor, and she was critical. We learned lessons. I learned. Andrew Kelly did some really good work on accountability and how you work with universities to align their strategies with board priorities in terms of, goal settings. We just adopted their model wholesale. We made some tweaks and stuff and all these things, but you don't have to make it as part of the rationale for, blog series, lessons learned, assets, pay it forward, because I can name the people who we, ripped off and borrowed from and graciously spent their time, on the phone. When I started down this path, Maine was doing integration, Connecticut, we talked to these people a lot, at the early stage in particular, to get lessons learned, right? So there's that sharing. And so, and in those conversations, you begin to realize, okay, there are some strategies. Yeah, we're going to have to make some stuff up on our own, but there are some strategies that we can adopt. We don't have to make everything up wholesale. And that has been a huge, benefit in a way. And I think it behooves all of us to really think, and it's the work that you do, is, how do you return the lessons learned in a way that people can adopt and adapt and move them forward and build on them. It's important.
You're making me realize there's a background piece here where you came into this work with, again, I think that was, as someone who was a Gates grantee during your time, that in every conversation with you, like you were always like fascinated by, like, you wanted to talk about the stuff. It wasn't like perfunctory, like report on your, thing, whatever. It was always like you're a deeply curious person. And I think the fact that you had that curiosity and the chance to observe and watch change across multiple states, systems, different, different levels prior. You came in with, I think, a better understanding of how change might happen. I think you had some theories, but you were willing to test them. Harrison, he works as a staffer in the legislature way prior, right? So he knows how to actually get stuff passed in the belly of the beast, which is, I think, so critical for why they were able to achieve what they did, because he's not just a phenomenal scholar and a brilliant mind around policy, but it's because he knows how to get stuff done in a state that you better know, because you're not getting any bills passed. And then also Kim was, I think she was the deputy chief of staff for the governor a long time ago too. So she also knows that belly of the beast. So I think in general, each of these is a good case study of when you have a leader who comes in really having an understanding that you don't get to make stuff happen.
Yeah.
It's like a humility and kind of a willingness to surf the wave and curiosity that is essential. Otherwise you're going to have, I've seen a lot of folks try and lead change that bless their hearts. It's like,
well, I mean, look, there are many aspects, and you learn, and I suppose maybe a lesson. There are a bunch of fundamental things you need. One of them is that political. You need to be that. There has to be that political capability, and you either have to be it, hire it, or source it somewhere, because there's there's n number of things you need, and with a project management at a sophisticated level, without that, there's none of this. I mean, from the sounds mundane and technical, but without data, you're going to fly blind. Without sort of a really informed advocacy and, frankly, internal and external communications effort, you're done. I mean, so there are a handful of capabilities. I would argue they're not, how they will be manifest may be different place to place, but if you don't have them all in place somehow and are not functioning really well together, game over, right? And it's interesting, assembling, there's a playbook. Here's the 7 things you really need to advance in this kind of way, and here are their attributes, and then after there is a couple blogs. One of them is about culture, and one of them is about political context. And the argument is that culture will establish the contours of what's possible for an organization to do, and so will its political context. And it's not about culture eats strategy for breakfast. Not necessarily believe that. It is a culture can be a powerful leverage point for change, but you have to understand it. The political context in which you operate can be a powerful, you think of it as an impediment. No, it's a powerful lever for change, but you have to know how to pull on the lever where, right? And so, immersion in those kinds of environments is absolutely critical, not just in designing the strategy, but because you're designing the strategy to implement in a culture within a political context, in thinking about its implementation path. Those are, again, critical components of any kind of change effort.
So I know that we're going long a bit, but I love that. And I want to ask you another question about learning, continuous improvement, learning, innovation, right? So how to foster a culture of continuous learning and innovation amongst faculty and staff, because just asking that question, I think a layperson might look at higher education and be like, well, why would you need to foster that? Allegedly, your university's education, you should be interested in learning. But there's a beautiful image that I've shown once that is from the Institute for Innovation in Large Organizations, about how organizations either have a efficiency outcome as their core operating tendency or learning. And they are very different, right? Like Apple, very different than I think if you were just a manufacturing like any kind of company that manufactures a thing, right? And colleges and universities, we have a big part of our work that is actually about efficiency, and it is not about curiosity. It is actually not about trying to learn. That people are needing to just make it cheaper, make it easier, keep it, make sure we're offering it consistently. And that is counter to our desire to have people curious and testing new models and learning. And so I want to know, while you're trying to push this culture of data, which is about efficiency and accountability and transparency, how, do you have any lessons learned from, or just want to react to the idea of the difficulty of those two tensions?
Yeah, and I would say the data is certainly about efficiency, but it's about driving to outcomes, and those outcomes can be learning, right? So, you set out on a path to improve outcomes for, X, and, students in particular areas or whatever, to improve employment outcomes, or, and you're using your data to test your innovations or your approaches so you can constantly refine and improve them. So yeah, I think this is the hardest thing to do, frankly, and it's the hardest thing to do in financially constrained institutions, right? So in our universities, our faculty teach a 4-4. That's a lot. You know, their sections are fully loaded because we have to operate. You know, we don't have a lot of spare cash, so they're fully booked. Our staff, you know, similarly, we don't have the luxury of you know, throwing lots and lots of people at stuff, and we need to innovate. And so, you know, and we're pretty hierarchical in the industry generally, as well as in PASSHE. And so the question is, how do you empower your employees to learn, to figure stuff out? The people who are best suited to figuring out, you know, how more impactfully to do, I don't know, financial aid advising are financial aid advisors. You know, administrators like me, you know, and professionals, you know, we're very much attuned to the national dialogue and all the rest of it. The people who are like on the ground, they're the ones who are going to, you know, in larger organizations which are successful, you know, whether it's a Google or an Apple, you know, they're trying to push innovation as close as you can to the source of the problem, right? And that is something how do we empower our folks, right? In organizations which are cash strapped and everybody's working flat out. I think that's one of our biggest problems, you know, and it's a challenge for leadership, because in organizations which are cash strapped, you know, and basically in recession management, leaders do not want to let go, because letting go, there's a fear of, you know, overexpending expenditure or whatever. And that's exactly what we need to do if we're going to foster innovations. We're going to have to find time for people to explore and to learn and to engage in in a dialogue about how they should improve their practice. I read this book called All In for AI, and it's about the organizations which are, you know, successful with AI, and it's written a few years ago, so it's a little dated, but I'm sure it's true today. They are the organizations which are deliberately going out of their way to give people time to empower employees, support them with training and resources so they can gather the skills they need to just go and play with AI in their professional areas, to begin to explore, and then to sort of feed back into the process of what should we do here to be part of the solutioning kind of, you know, environment and team. And that is just not something we do. And I went to, actually, we were at ASU and GSB together, and it was all about AI, as you know, and I'm listening to people talk about all the cool shit they're doing. And I'm like, oh my God, we're dead in the water, because it is all the folks who are really doing cool shit are doing that. And I'm like, oh my God, this is not a technical problem. This is not, I mean, technology problem. It's a cultural thing. Very few of our organizations, I mean, we empower our faculty to do what they do in the classroom, thank God, and in our research institutions, in the research organization, but we don't empower them to contribute to the continuous learning as an organization so that we get better, you know. And we got to figure that out, because whether it's AI or something else, it's just, it's not going to take root, and you can't do this stuff from the top down. It's just not going to happen.
This is the slide I was talking about from the innovation in large organizations, about how basically, if you're an efficiency-oriented organization, you're going to focus on repeating success, process control, specialization, low autonomy, and yet you want people in discovery as well.
Yep.
Testing and learning, new market, they're very different. And so to expect one of the other without recognizing, that's going to require culture, and it has totally different dimensions, but they both, the thing that is the greatest, like the thing that holds back innovation is really the issue around lowering the cost of failure. That is the big challenge, is if you can lower the cost of failure for either entity, no matter who they are, so that it's less risky to try something new, then you can drive innovation. But otherwise, you're gonna run into those impediments.
You'll love this. I was on a panel once with Jeffrey Moore, who writes about, you know, innovation and industry and stuff. And his theory and his books are all about, you know, how you basically you give an entirely separate P&L to your innovative arm, right? You just that is the cost of it, and it's a pretty big chunk of the overall revenues of the company. And it's not necessarily intended to be, you know, turn value in terms of, you know, revenue. And so we're sitting on this panel, and there's two hired people on the panel. They turn to us, "You do that, right, with your innovation?" I'm like, no. Right? No. I mean, yeah, I guess we could, but we'd have to start closing all these other programs in order to deliberate, to reallocate the resources that we need. But it's, you know, we've got to figure that out if we're going to become that learning organization, which is going to be so important in finding paths, not just for our institution sustainability, more importantly for our student success.
Yeah. Well, that's a great way for us to end this. I appreciate again for hopping on here, Dan, and giving us
Great.
the insights you've had. And for those of you at home, you got to go to Greenstein or Greenstein.com is the blog /PASSHE. And you'll be able to follow along on his journey as he's trying to document and dispense wisdom that he's learning in real time while the scars are still healing. I think it's brave, it's smart, and I hope more of us will consider not waiting until there's a, when you've forgotten the hard stuff to share, because I think we'll glamorize things up and you polish it up and you make it seem like it's a lot easier than it is. So that's a great lesson. And I so have appreciated you sharing your wisdom, and you're always welcome to stop by anytime.
Bridget, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. See ya.